limited series from Student Affairs Now, the online learning community for higher education and student affairs. I'm your host, Heather Shea. We're recording this episode at 5:06 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, April 24th. As always, things may have changed by the time you listen. Each week, we are breaking down the shifting landscape of higher education, what's happening, why it matters, and how we can respond. This week, we're tracking three consequential stories: federal research dollars at risk, attempts to reshape accreditation, and university tax-exempt status. These aren't just hypotheticals, these are direct attempts to redefine governance and the values of higher education. So what does this mean for those of us on campus, and what can we do? That's what we'll unpack today with our expert guests. So let's welcome this week's correspondents. Back again this week, Dr. Demetri L. Morgan. Welcome, Demetri.
Hello, glad to be back.
Demetri is an expert in institutional governance, campus climate, student activism, and STEM education in higher ed. He is an associate professor of education at the University of Michigan. And welcome back, Dr. Brendan Cantwell.
Hello, good to be here.
We haven't seen you since I think week 2 or 3, so we're excited that you're back. Dr. Cantwell, Brendan is an expert in higher education policy, governance, and the political economy of higher education. He is a professor of higher adult and lifelong education here at Michigan State University. So appreciate you both being here with me today. So I'm going to dive into the 3 stories, and then I'm going to end on a positive note with 2 other things that have just recently happened. So first, the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, has issued a direct threat that requires universities to certify that they are not running, quote, illegal DEI programs to keep their research grants. So for campuses who depend on NIH funding, especially in STEM, I see this as a pretty direct attack on faculty autonomy and years of equity-driven work. So we've asked this question in multiple other week's episodes, but what happens when advancing research with federal funds means abandoning our equity initiatives? The second topic, in a story foretold by Dr. Felicia Commodore, yesterday, President Trump signed an executive order targeting accreditors, higher education accrediting agencies. It gives the Secretary of Education power to deny or suspend recognition of these agencies that broadly require institutions to address DEI as part of the accreditation process. So the Council for Higher Education Accreditation warns that this move threatens the independence of these agencies, and the AAUP, American Association of University Professors, calls this an attempt to reshape higher education to fit an authoritarian political agenda. Pretty strong words there from the AAUP. Finally, the third story, the administration has also threatened to revoke tax-exempt status from schools like Harvard. Just want to clarify, legally, this is not within presidential power. Only the IRS can revoke 501c3 status, and that's only after a formal process, right? So further, there is section, I had to look this up, section 7217 of the tax code prohibits the White House from influencing IRS investigations. So take that for what you will. Regardless, this is increasing talk about the nonprofit status of higher education institutions. So those are the 3 top stories. I also want to note that we're finally seeing a stronger higher ed coalition and legal resistance. So just earlier this week, over 220 higher ed leaders signed a joint AAC and U statement condemning these actions. This is one of the strongest, most unified pushbacks I've seen yet. And then earlier today, a federal judge in New Hampshire blocked the administration from withholding Title I funds from K-12 schools over DEI. She called the policy vague, unconstitutional, and a threat to free speech. And I think this matters for higher ed too, because some of these same funding ultimatums are also being aimed at colleges. And so maybe this ruling will offer a legal roadmap for pushback. As always, sources and citations are in our episode notes, so let's get into it. Demetri, I'm going to start with you. Given what I've just shared, where should we begin? What do you want to talk about related to these stories and how they're affecting colleges and universities?
I really want to talk about well, all of them, but I think starting at the NIH ultimatum is really important. And forgive me, I'm going to nerd out a little bit. And I'm really curious for Professor Cantwell's perspective and yours as well. But when we talk about organizational theory in higher ed, one of the hallmark kind of descriptions of higher ed. And one of the things that makes it different from other organizations is that it's a loosely coupled organization.
Mm,
Easiest way to explain this when I'm teaching it to students is like what's happening in athletics doesn't necessarily impact what's happening in the classroom. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. What's happening in student affairs might not impact academic affairs, and so we're very loosely coupled, and it provides strengths sometimes, right? If there's a crisis in one place, it doesn't necessarily mean we have to stop everything going on somewhere else. But also, we know that if there's weaknesses, it creates silos. And so, all that to say, one of the things that is worries me about the NIH is that it's trying to more tightly couple different
mm,
segments of the institution. So, for example, you have NIH, which largely funds, almost exclusively funds medical research,
mhm,
and now you're saying, hey, if you have any quote unquote DEI, which is not defined in the order,
mhm.
anywhere else in the institution,
Anywhere.
anywhere, you have to certify that you don't have DEI going on anywhere else in the institution in order to receive NIH funds. And so that historically, that type of coupling is historically not something that has characterized large, complex higher education institutions, and even smaller ones where people do wear more hats. We still are pretty loosely coupled in how we move through. And so I think one of the reasons why this is an important story to watch and understand is that historically, when there's been crises or challenges in other places, it doesn't always make it to your doorstep.
Mm,
But this is one that is very directly trying to kind of more tightly couple the different organizational cultures that exist within higher ed and it too, and kind of having it pit different sides against each other. Do you want to keep access to your research funds, or do you want to
mhm,
keep supporting DEI? And so it's a strategy at two levels. Obviously, there's the financial and there's the potential loss of programs, but it's also pitting people within higher ed against each other to say, and it happened in a recent faculty call where there was a research scientist who was like, hey, like, can we not pursue this like DI stuff? I don't want to lose my job because I'm soft money funded. And so that's really tough to hear one of your colleagues be like, hey, like, no, my job is on the line. And so that two levels of attack makes it really difficult to sort of think about and talk about, but also all the more important to kind of track what's happening because it's really far reaching.
That's fascinating.
I
Brendan, yeah, that's super fascinating. I mean, I think yeah, I mean it's pitting it parts of the institution against one another. Brendan, what would you share about that? And then we can go to the next story.
Yeah, I think that Dimitri is absolutely right that this approach to linking biomedical grant funding
Mhm.
to other activities is a strategy that exploits the loose coupling of universities. A few weeks ago on Blue Sky, I called it mission splitting.
Oh,
So the strategy is that the administration is going to pit one mission against another at the university and kind of create internal conflict and try to force the university to choose which of its
yeah.
missions it prefers. And that creates all kinds of internal tensions on campus
Mhm.
as Dr. Morgan was pointing out, you have, people saying, hey, you doing this thing may jeopardize my job.
Yeah.
Whereas We think that supporting students, creating diverse learning environments is important for education, and being inclusive is a sort of ethical and educational imperative that we have. And so you've put these things in tension with each
Yeah.
other. And I think it's kind of predictable that that is what they hope to do.
Mhm.
They were broadcasting that in advance of the
Mhm.
election, and after the president was elected. But it is both fascinating and horrifying to see it play out,
Yes.
and to see where things are going. So that's my reaction to that story,
Yeah.
and to Professor Morgan's really insightful comments on it.
Yeah. I'm really curious about the accreditation story as well, but partially because we've been kind of waiting. I feel like this was the same as the executive order to dismantle the Department of Ed, right? Like we were like, okay, is it happening? Is it happening? But I also want to note that for the audience for Student Affairs Now, they may not understand exactly what accreditation means and why oversight of accrediting agencies is so complicated and concerning. And why Dr. Commodore was like, this is keeping me up at night. I'm worried about it. So, Brenda, do you want to tackle that first, and then we'll go back to Demetri?
Sure. So, quick crash course in the way higher education works in the United States. Um, the federal government and the state governments, in a sense, outsource quality assurance to these independent nonprofit accrediting agencies, which is a form of peer review, so
Mm-hmm,
that members of the academic field evaluate each other and
mm-hmm,
determine whether campuses are meeting expected or best practices in terms of governance, curriculum, campus environment, and so on. And when the Higher Education Act established a framework for administering federal financial aid, accreditors were given the responsibility of certifying whether a campus would be eligible for federal
mm,
financial aid. So the federal government doesn't determine that itself. It actually relies on the judgment of accreditors, which is in a way relying on academic judgment to determine which colleges and universities qualify for federal financial aid. And so over time, accreditors have asked colleges and universities to do a lot of things, including meeting standards for governance and managing their money and maintaining a relevant curriculum and updating programs and so on. One of the things that some accreditors have asked universities to do is to develop plans for making sure that their students are welcomed and supported, and for putting plans in place to ensure that all students on campus have a chance to succeed and to graduate. And these days, all that falls under the DEI rubric in many
no
ways. And
doubt.
so, what the administration is potentially saying is that if accreditors ask campuses, ask colleges and universities to pay attention to things
Mm-hmm,
like campus climate, to pay attention to things like equity gaps in attainment and opportunity,
mm-hmm,
then they're in violation of the law, and the accreditor is decertified, and it can't provide or potentially decertified, and it
mm-hmm,
can't then provide that sort of golden ticket to get federal financial aid.
mm-hmm,
So it takes away a big lever to ensure that campuses are being accountable to their students.
mm-hmm,
And it's another sign that the administration is very serious to use these pretty powerful coercive measures to achieve its cultural
mm-hmm,
goals. Whether or not that's going to work, I think in a kind of hopeful note, remains an open question. It's going to work. It's working to some
mm-hmm.
extent. How far it works and how far this goes and whether this uh, holds up in court and
Yeah.
proves to be something the administration can do still remains an open question. But this is an anticipated development. Dr. Commodore predicted it. Others have
Mhm.
predicted it. It was in Project 2025.
Mhm.
But nonetheless, a serious development and one that we ought to be
Mhm.
paying a lot of attention to. Directly impacts the way that student affairs professionals could work with their students.
Mhm. Yeah, Demetri, you want to add something about accreditation or move on to the third topic?
Things, so, I think, and rightfully so, a lot of the focus and fear is on accreditation's role in the financial aid process. And so when we're
Hmm.
saying financial aid, we mean Pell Grants, but also loans
Hmm.
and other idled funds that are part of the Higher Education Act. So massive, but there's lots of other like nitty-gritty things. And one example I always point to is, if you're a student, we know, a good number of students transfer institutions, and
Right.
you need to be from an accredited institution to transfer to another accredited institution. And so imagine Michigan State losing its accreditation. Oh, we'll put it up. What was it? Michigan loses its accreditation, and I that wants to transfer to Michigan State.
Yeah.
Michigan State might not be inclined to accept my transfer
Hmm.
credits because all of a sudden Michigan isn't an accredited institution that's recognized by a body. So I think that it obviously the financial aid piece, but also think about student mobility and all the reasons students move for whatever
Hmm.
reason,
Hmm.
and how much more difficult that will come. But I think the other layer of the story too that I'm really interested to follow on and very nervous about is the as Professor Cantwell mentioned, this sort of outsourcing of quality assurance came about because we assume that our Congress people and even our executive branch are busy and only have so much expertise to do all of the things that are on their plate, the proverbial plate. And so we have what are called intermediaries that play a variety of roles to help principals, in this case the federal government, carry out all of the things. And so when you remove or start to play with some of these intermediaries that have really
Hmm.
specific expertise and in this sense sort of technical academic expertise of what makes a quality program, what makes a good education, what makes good governance, you start to replace it with other forms of expertise. And so there's also
Hmm.
been a play here for the last sort of 20 years from not only the for-profit realm, the for-profit colleges,
Right.
university realm, but also from newer, we'll call them educational providers who
Hmm.
have not been able to meet all of the sort of accrediting standards that are more established and have been pecking away at this
Hmm.
in hopes that they'll have access to federal funds, which is really the corner of the realm, but also that students can transfer to and from and have their credentials be valid. And so the other thing that I'm watching and trying to sort of not be naive, but as hopeful as possible, is that I do think personally, and I'd be curious how you all feel about this. I am curious what other forms of educational credentials, whether it's micro credentials um, or competency-based education, um, what that would look like actually sort of more formally a part of. There are
Hmm.
a few Western governors, there's a few here and
Hmm.
there, but would more educational providers place downward pressure on institutions, or would it just open it up and be big? And I think that's part of the spin that is put out there, like, oh, we need more educational providers. And part of me wants to say, like, yes, if done well, and if if not loading people with debt in sort of diploma mill degrees,
Yep.
maybe. But then I'm like, you're being naive. Like that's not what's
Hmm.
going to happen. That's not what this is about. But I do think that's part of the rhetoric people will hear. So it's important to kind of be able to read through that people are going to say, oh, we need alternate models of education and competency-based and all of these things. But it's really been, a decades-long project of providers to try to get into the kind of financial aid funnel, and now they have their moment. So we're going to
Hmm.
see this thrust that's really important to sort of watch.
Yeah. So Brendan knows this because we're both on the same campus. Michigan State just got its 10-year renewal from the Higher Learning Commission for accreditation. I got to participate in the process a little bit this year, and it's over a year long data gathering and then inquiry process. I mean, it is a massive undertaking. And so I can't imagine that the expertise lies within, other bodies, right? I mean, I think the accrediting agencies, they sent out a group of people to do a site visit and spend days talking with folks. Yeah, it's a huge undertaking. But you mentioned something that made me think a little bit about this idea of tax exempt status, and that's for profits, right? So for profit higher education institutions are not tax exempt, as their name would imply. And now there's this threat, and I think it's based on, I mean, it's targeted, of course, to Harvard, but I think it's being also broadly talked about. Like, why are colleges and universities tax exempt? And so, Brendan, do you want to kick us off with this, or Demetri?
Why are they tax exempt
Yes.
is an interesting question, and I
Yeah.
guess the simplest answer is that they're seen, at least to some extent, as organizations that are contributing to the public good. They're
Public good.
like
Yeah.
charitable in that sense, that
Mm-hmm.
they're contributing things that are good for society, and you wouldn't want the imposition of a tax to to cause the sector to produce less education, right?
Yes.
Or less research. And so tax exempt status is a way to promote the sort of common good mission of higher education. I think the administration's a sort of attack on tax exempt status is another way to attempt to control
Mm.
higher education
Mm-hmm.
and to have this lever of influence. And I think it also points, along with accreditation and the sort of attempted to adjustment to indirect rates and this sort of broadside on
Mm-hmm.
DEI, it's taking things that have been addressed in education policy circles in sometimes sophisticated and sometimes less sophisticated ways, but have been points of critique and conversation and debate. And like, should Harvard, there's
Mm-hmm.
lots of sort of left-wing conversation about Harvard being a hedge fund with a university attached and so on. And it takes these conversations that have been going on kind of in the background and it weaponizes them for
Mm-hmm.
partisan gain. And I think that that's a big like underlying theme is that most of these moves haven't come out of nowhere. Yes, they've
Yeah.
come out of places like Project 2025, but even beyond that, they reflect sort of really wonky and scholarly and advocacy group kind of
Mm-hmm.
conversations that have been simmering for a long time, including discontent with higher education that people in the kind of technocratic centrist space and even the left advocacy
Mm-hmm.
space have had, and just really transforms them and leverages them for like their particular political aims.
Yeah. Super interesting.
Yeah. So in full disclosure, I have to admit, um, I last year for a fellowship, I was in that kind of connected education scholars with policymakers. One of my policy engagements was with Representative Nancy Mace's office. I didn't actually meet with Nancy Mace, but met with a staffer. And the bill that I was talking with the staffer on was about nonprofits. And what was interesting is that if you follow Congress, Nancy Mace represents a district in South Carolina that's on the coastline.
Mm.
And so essentially the bill was about helping the federal government coordinate with nonprofits. And the sort of subtext was like, hey, in the aftermath of a natural disaster,
Mm.
sometimes nonprofits, broadly defined, are able to be more responsive than the federal government. So what does coordination look like? Um, but to say the bill was not written with any specificity. So one of the things that I was talking about was like, hey, do you realize like you just say any nonprofit, which is
Yeah.
everywhere from Harvard to your local mom and pop nonprofit that, is, running soup kitchens. And I think all that to say, one of the things to really watch here, if you're following along this particular story, is that it's really, really difficult to kind of go in with a scalpel and say, I just want
Mm.
to attack Harvard's nonprofit status, but not the United Way or Big
Right.
Brothers Big Sisters or the YMCA or like some of the beloved nonprofits that exist in
Mm.
people's local communities that people, when they think about Big Brothers Big Sisters and Harvard, they're like, oh, those are two different organizations, but
Mhm.
they have the same tax exempt status. And how
Mhm.
do you, as a federal government, make a case that I'm going to say, yes, it's okay for Big Brothers Big Sisters to keep being a nonprofit, but no to Harvard? What is the sort of material difference? And they're trying, right? They're
Yeah.
focusing on anti-Semitism, foreign influence, and gifts, but it gets really sort of technical and nitty gritty in a way that's hard to defend across the wide scope of nonprofits that are out there. So, of all of the news, I don't want to say I'm not worried because I'm always worried about everything the federal government, but there are a lot of tentacles to the sort of nonprofit case
Mhm.
that will activate other segments of that once people start to see like, oh, you're talking about the United Way,
Mhm.
or oh, you're talking about the
Mhm.
Salvation Army, and somebody can just come in and remove their nonprofit. Like, I don't know if I like that. That's going to be a really hard
Mhm.
political theater game to play and walk that fine line. And some of the things that I'm hearing as well from some of the conversations I'm in is that the sort of nonprofit sector is sort of ready to stand together
Yeah.
in ways. And so, like the Nonprofit Council has already put out some really good explainers and primers, kind of preparing and readying. Because earlier this week, and interestingly, it didn't happen on Earth Day, which was Tuesday.
Uh-huh.
There were some rumors that there were going to be some executive orders targeting environmental related nonprofits and going after there and making environmental advocacy not a thing that is in the public's best interest, which is somehow
Wild.
it didn't come through, and so that doesn't mean it won't. But some of even the advocacy that was going on earlier this week, some are pointing to how complicated it gets when you start to kind of come out after this whole sector. So I think it's really important to follow because the implications are massive. But it's one of those things that does very quickly create coalitions that are
Mhm.
beyond higher ed in the way that in the way that like indirects is kind
Mhm.
of a very higher ed thing. The,
Mhm.
the sort of nonprofit status is much greater, much broader, and will activate in people's consciousness much sooner than some of the other kind of accreditation or indirects.
Yeah. Wow. So I've been thinking about this mostly through the lens of there's nothing that Trump can really do in this space. But now after hearing you both talk about it, I'm like, oh my goodness, there's maybe a much bigger repercussion that I hadn't considered, and also this coalition idea. So let's move to what we can do within our spheres of influence. So Brendan, we talked about these three stories. When you think about student affairs folks, higher ed administrators, what are some possible actions that we might be able to take to navigate this environment that we're in at this moment?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is encouraging is, you compared to when I appeared on the first couple of episodes
Mm-hmm.
of this limited series, universities were pretty much sitting on the sidelines and
Yep.
not doing much. I think we're starting to see some mobilization and act, activation of the
Mm-hmm.
sector because one, I think people are realizing that you're not negotiating with a good faith actor. So
Yeah.
like trying to approach this as you would other governments is not useful. And
Mm-hmm.
two, because the administration, like the scariest part of what the administration is doing is that it's doing all of this, right? It's trying to do all of this and it's
Mm-hmm.
so extensive and far reaching, but there's like silver lining's not the right word, but there's like another aspect of that is that they are overreaching.
Yeah.
And that overreach is starting to create some pushback. So if
Mm-hmm.
you are not probably on your campus like the lead pushbacker in
Yeah.
terms of speaking for the campus or like representing it in government relations or in lawsuits. I'm certainly not.
Yeah.
But
Nope.
what you can do is quietly, circulate the examples of campuses that are pushing back
Mhm.
on your campus to kind of build that norm that this is
Mhm.
something that is happening and it's not just a few, it's actually a broad set of campuses that
Mhm.
are starting to and leaders that are starting to speak out. And also quietly document the impacts of this stuff on
Yes.
your students,
Yes.
on your colleagues, on your ability to fulfill the educational mission, because there are going to be lawsuits that are going to proceed, and they're going to need examples of harm. And
Mhm. Mhm.
so if you're working with students and you see the consequences of what's happening in the students' lives and the ability of students to pursue
Mhm.
their education and to succeed, and document that
Yeah.
because that could potentially be useful in a strategy to push back on this, and it is certainly useful information for campuses as they try to think about ways to mitigate
Mm.
what's happening.
Mm.
Paying attention and documenting.
That's great. Dr.
Beautiful.
Morgan, what would you add as things we can do? Yeah.
No, that's excellent. So, one of the things that I have been talking a lot about with students and colleagues, and today's topics are a good example, is that we need additional help and people who are
Mm.
conversant and able to explain some of the idiosyncrasies. So what am I getting at? You should practice talking about accreditation, or
Yeah.
with your colleagues. I'm glad you shared, Heather, that you were able to participate a little bit in your reaccreditation process, because it doesn't become real for people unless they
Yeah.
get access to some of that.
Yeah.
And so, at your next, department meeting or your next union meeting, ask like, how does the roles that we're doing or the work that we do feed into the accreditation process? When's the last time we were up for our 10-year, accreditation? Just become more conversant in it, because one of the things that some of these strategies that we've talked about today bank on is that only a few people on campus will like sort of really know the ins and outs and
Mhm.
nitty gritties, and things that go on are missed because not everybody's like, oh, this is where accreditation comes in, or this is where why losing accreditation could be really harmful. And so, I was talking with social work colleagues a couple of weeks ago, and I sort of, listening to Dr. Commodore mention accreditation. And if you're in a field that's heavily accredited,
Yeah.
like social work, they were like, what? Like
Mhm.
they could do that? And I was like, yes, they could. And so we need more people, being conversant to be able to help other people say like, hey, these things are relevant for you. And again, you don't have to have the sort of level of depth that, Professor Cantwell has, but just being able to talk about it in words and ways that make sense to you, I think is really good practice, and we need more people who are conversant in it. And so it's a really good thing. And because every campus, it connects with the accreditation apparatus in some way, you can look
Mhm.
up your campus's accreditation. You can
Mhm.
read the latest report. You can, familiarize yourself with the standards. It's just good professional development, even just to be like, yeah, what did we say in our last one? Where did we have any areas where we were sort of docked or we approved on? Outside of all of this, I think it's just good practice to know that at the university level, but now even more so, because when you start to get messages from your institution about what they may or may not be doing in response to some of the accreditation threats, you'll be able to also read and kind of understand that
Mhm.
with a different level of depth if you've done kind of your own reading and preparation, with what that looks like. And so I think that that's really something that any and everybody at all levels of the kind of student affairs kind of landscape can do and it should do.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really enlightening. And I mean, I think looking up the different accrediting agencies and seeing what they are requiring for institutions to show as evidence is basically, are you doing what you say you're doing? And how do you demonstrate that? By disaggregating data, student success data, and then showing the results of that. So I thought it was a really interesting experience. And in all honesty, this wasn't one of our top three topics today until Dr. Commodore sent an email to us and was like, don't forget. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like this has got to be a standalone topic. And Keith and I had a back conversation where he's like, I don't know that everybody knows what accreditation is, because it is like something that doesn't come around all that often. And it's really, it has massive repercussions, but it usually is, a smaller group of people who are directly involved. So,
Also, too, especially for student affairs folks, because we
mhm,
are a sort of field that, unless you have sort of a counseling connection,
yep.
it is not an accredited field. We are also less conversant in. So we absolutely have CAS standards, right? The Council for Advancement of Standards,
Mhm.
and the NASPA and ACPA competencies, but those are sort of a different level or
Yeah.
threshold than sort of full-on accreditation or other programs that are accredited. So even as a field, the way we enter into the conversation is going to look different. So we kind of have to do our own transposing into like, oh yeah, like I know CAP standards, or I know the ACPA, NASPA competencies, or insert the alphabet soup competencies that
Yep.
exist for the different professional associations. But that's different than kind of like the big six accreditors, and then program specific accreditors that exist for different programs. And so just kind of understanding the landscape is a really good place to start, and seeing how student affairs fits in and doesn't, relative to like the formal standards that exist in other places.
So there's one story we haven't talked about too much, which is the 220 leaders. I keep looking at it to see if our institution's leader has signed on. Not yet, but your institutions did, Demetri.
Oh,
So,
I think yesterday,
yep,
not. So
yep.
I'm
So,
happy.
message to President of Michigan State University. We'd love to see your name on there. But I think it's a really interesting show of connection and coalition building. So just, I mean, to me, elevating that as a show of unity, because these are institutions that are vastly different, right? And for them to sign on to a joint statement over 220 institutions. I mean, we know there are many, many more institutions in the US, but I don't know. Any thoughts on that as far as like what we can do to keep our institutions relevant?
I think the statement is good. It's
Yeah.
fine. It is it's not especially strident. It's not
Right.
like, it's not like, hey, federal government, take this. Um, but it's strong enough.
Yeah.
I think the important thing about it is that the number keeps growing, and it
Yeah.
suggests that the kind of normative pressure on campuses is shifting. That like,
Mm,
and now being seen as being opposed to what's happening is
mhm,
something that is acceptable and not seen and not
mm.
understood as being out there or being too
That's
political
key.
or violating neutrality, not being a neutral platform or something like that. So the normative, the message, the signal that it's sending that it's okay to offer a little bit of pushback is the important thing to me.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's not lost on me the sort of timing, right? Like,
Yeah.
graduation is next week for us. Like, we're
Yep.
moving into a different season and time, and so again, trying to think the best of things. It's like, okay, this makes sense to kind of do this now. Like, students are transitioning to off campus, and so can presidents and other university leaders turn their attention to these things.
Hmm.
And then I think courage is contagious, right? Like, you just
Mm,
need some people to say like, yeah. And other people are like, okay, like I can, maybe sign my name and do the next step. And these sort of incremental steps I do think are very important. And so, I think we have to be like quick and loud with our critiques, but we also, and which is why I'm really glad you're raising the story. We should also sort of applaud and sort of hat
mhm,
tip when leaders and other decision makers are doing things that we think will help institutions and help students and help communities. And both things can be true, right? And so I'm big into like, yeah, when people do something that's sort of even slightly courageous, like let's say like good on you, and hope that it leads to the next thing.
That's great. All right. Final thoughts. What's on the horizon and what's keeping you up at night and what's bringing you joy right now? So, Brendan, I'm going to start with you.
I think on the horizon are lawsuits,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and we're going to see more of them, and universities as party to them.
Hmm.
What keeps me up at night is I am r remain concerned that there's going to be some kind of a provoking event on a campus, a
Mm.
protest, an encounter, that is going to that's going to create much more internal conflict
Mm.
on a particular campus, on campuses nationwide, and that if the level of internal conflict increases at the same time as this federal external pressure, that things are just going to be very difficult. So
Mm.
that's the sort
Mm.
of thing that keeps me up at night. Um, I'm like, come on, students, I want you to protest, but also be smart.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what's bringing me joy, a little embarrassed to say this maybe, but trees. So I really like to
Yes.
be around trees. They really bring me a sense of calm. And in the part of the country where all of us live,
Yeah.
the trees are starting to leaf out, and
Yeah.
it's to me like when the trees leaf out, it's a hopeful time.
Yeah.
Also, it means that graduation and summer vacations summer breaks
Yeah.
coming up. But so it's the trees that are bringing me joy.
I love that. Yes, the all the different flowering trees. I'm also like, there's like a patch of pink over there. And, yeah. All right. How about you, Dimitri? What's on the horizon, keeping you up at night and bringing you joy?
Yeah, so two things that are kind of on the horizon and keeping me up at night. So Congress has been on a couple week sort of. I mean, Congress takes a lot of breaks for all of their like waste, fraud, and abuse, but but when they come back, we're going to start to get into the weeds of this kind of one big beautiful bill, which is a
Mm,
tax bill. And I'm
mhm,
really worried because one of the things that, sort of a pattern is that when there are economic or financial sort of headwinds or challenges, the Trump administration seems to turn to sort of culture war wins, whether it's
mm,
immigration or sort of dunking on higher ed.
yeah.
And so, we had the tariff debacle of the last 2 weeks. And so it does not surprise me, right, that we get a slew of EOs that kind of stick it to the education apparatus. It's a way of shifting the narrative, giving the kind of
Mhm.
conservative MAGA sort of media sphere something else to focus on and talk about where they are, sort of demonstrating wins. But I think we are very clearly going to come into heads with how this tax bill is going to be written, and I'm just worried about the collateral damage of who sort of gets thrown, who or
Yeah.
what gets thrown under the bus as the sort of sausage making gets into it, especially when the sort of conservative budget hawks versus people who are trying to fulfill the agenda,
Hmm.
will not be able to iron it out as easily as I think people are making it out to be. So I'm watching that. And then the other thing is, I'm worried. Last summer we saw when students left campus. It's I know Michigan. I'm not sure about Michigan State. Institutions made a ton of changes to their student codes of conduct, to
Mm,
ways that they, sort of were going to police campuses and encampments. And I am, and sort of people tracked it last year because we were still kind of coming off it. But
mhm,
I'm worried about what changes institutions are going to make sort of in the quiet of summer,
mm,
that are going to be equally impactful but less tracked because it's not coming on the heels of the encampments sort of wrapping up. That's something that I'll be
mm.
tracking. And what's made me enjoy similar, just being outdoors. Ann Arbor has a lot of beautiful running paths, and so I've been able to get out with them, with my two girls, the last couple of Saturdays and just kind of run and get them outside. So it's been a lot of fun, and the weather has been beautiful. And yeah, and I'm excited to run in Denver. The weather's supposed to be really nice. So just kind of being outdoors.
Well, thank you both. And special thanks, Brendan. You are in Denver at AERA right now. And I know Demetri's on his way there. So thank you for taking the time to join us. This is our second to the last episode of this limited series. And so we'd love to hear from you if you have found these conversations like I have to be really useful and we hopefully will look to continue them on some cadence, maybe in the fall. So if you haven't caught up on all of our past episodes, you can find them at studentaffairsnow.com/current-campus-context. I want to send a special thanks as well to the other folks on the Student Affairs Now host team, especially Dr. Keith Edwards and Dr. Rochelle Pope, who today talked through the slew of different topics that we could have covered. I really think that, the velocity, right, is just, it's out of control. And I think that's obviously part of the tactic. So for me, these discussions have really mattered. So if you have suggestions or would like to hear a specific question or topic covered in our very last episode next Thursday, please send us an email at host@studentaffairsnow.com. Again, thank you, Dr. Brendan Cantwell. Thank you, Dr. Demetri Morgan. This has been Current Campus Context, brought to you by Student Affairs Now, and we will see you next week.